Hey everybody, welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields, and today we're going to do a recap of Big Brew Day 2023, where I brewed a beer called Nearly Nirvana. We're going to go through what that whole brew day entailed, how we did it, and we're going to even taste this beer at the end to see how I did. I haven't even tapped this thing behind me. So go ahead, grab yourself a beer, hit that like and subscribe button, and we're going to get after it after this. All right, so what is Big Brew Day? Well, every year the American Homebrewers Association does a day in May called Big Brew Day. And so what they do is they pick a recipe, but you don't have to brew that recipe. You can brew whatever beer you want, but they typically have a kind of sponsored recipe on their webpage. And this year it was called Nearly Nirvana. So I actually brewed that exact same beer. So it's a kind of a clone of Sierra Nevada's Pale Ale. It's this person's version who submitted the recipe. It's obviously not the exact recipe that Sierra Nevada uses, but after trial and error, this person put what he thought was the closest version on for everyone else to brew. So a lot of people brewed that specific beer, including myself, but you could have brewed any beer you wanted. The real point of Big Brew Day is to really open people's eyes and get people aware of the hobby of homebrewing. And so you not only can brew in your friend's garage or invite your homebrewer club over, but you can also brew on locations in different places where there are people to kind of help spread the word and get people into the hobby, or at least interested in homebrewing. And so I actually brewed at a brewery called Slow Play Brewing in Rock Hill, South Carolina. They invited me down. I said, absolutely. I packed up all my stuff, drove it down there, and we actually brewed on site on their patio. It was a beautiful day, and really want to thank them a lot for inviting me down and having hosted our event for our homebrew club there in order to kind of spread the word of homebrewing. And we get a lot of questions when we do these from people that come up to our tent and, hey, what are you guys doing? What's this all about? And we talk about the brewing process and how to get into the hobby of homebrewing itself. And so really a cool way to get people interested and get people who have otherwise love craft beer, maybe would want to try it themselves, get them into the hobby. So let's talk a little bit about the recipe, and then we're going to go ahead and tap this thing. So Nearly Nirvana, the recipe is all Cascade hops. It uses Cascade it's a 75-minute boil. They used whole cone hops. If you don't have those, I'll go ahead and I'll put my version of the recipe in the link below, and I'll also include a link to the Homebrewers Association website that you can check it out. The recipe I used is for 5.5 gallons, and I used pellet hops versus the whole leaf hops, so you can definitely do that conversion. But mainly it's a Cascade hops at 75 minutes, at 15 minutes, and at 5 minutes. In my recipe, I also dry hopped it to get a little bit more aroma, but that was not part of the original recipe. I just added that because you can change it up however you want to. But with the rest of the stuff, I stayed pretty consistent. For yeast, we used Lulamon's BRY 97, which is their West Coast ale yeast. It's a dry yeast, and so you can rehydrate and use that. That was recommended. This is the first time I actually used that specific yeast, so I was excited to try that. I did make a starter with that one just to make sure that it was fresh and ready to go. I brought that home after the brew day. It was with a lot of fun at Slow Play, and we went ahead and we pitched that yeast. That's where things got a little wonky. I pitched the yeast. It was at the right temperature to pitch. I went ahead and I walked away for a few hours. I realized that I forgot to turn on my heat source, which is my lizard lamp, and at the evenings we're still getting fairly cool, and it would actually get below my recommended temperature range. I actually got to the lower 60s, which really isn't that bad. I got to about 62, 63, which in most other cases I wouldn't have thought anything about that. But what I did notice was that the beer stalled fermentation at about 1.020, 1.019, so 1020, 1019-ish. And that really hasn't happened to me before, especially when I make a yeast starter and I make sure that I got enough healthy cells. But I'm thinking there's a couple of reasons why that may have happened. And the first might have been because we were actually mashing at a higher temperature than I normally would have done for this style of beer, at about 1056 or 1058. And by doing it at that higher temperature, it actually allows for less fermentable sugars and a little more sweetness in the beer because of that higher temperature. You want to be in that optimal range, and a lot of times for balanced beers, that optimal range is about 1052. But 1056, 1058 really isn't that high, and a lot of porters and stuff have that high and they ferment out just fine, but it does leave a little bit more residual sugar. So I was wondering, well, maybe that isn't, maybe that's just contributing to it, but maybe that isn't the reason. And so the final gravity for this beer was supposed to be 1.014 or 1014. So it was, 6 points off or so, right? 5-6 points off. And so what I did is I raised that temperature up to 75 degrees. And then I added a teaspoon of Yeast Energizer, which is a little bit different than yeast nutrient. They're two separate things, two separate reasons, but Yeast Energizer will help fix a stuck fermentation in certain cases. And so what I did is I raised that temperature up. I pitched in a teaspoon of the Yeast Energizer. I think it's a half teaspoon they recommend or something like that. And then I jostled it around a little bit, the fermenter, to kind of, not to aerate the wort necessarily, but to get that yeast back up off the bottom. So you don't really want to shake it all that hard, but at that point I hadn't opened up the fermenter much. I just kind of quickly dumped that in there, so I didn't want to get a bunch of oxygen in there. And then I roused up the yeast a little bit to get that energizer going and acting with the yeast to really help fermentation get started again. And I was calling for dry hopping in this one. And I was a little worried because if you dry hop at the very end of fermentation, before it's either all the way complete or at high Krausen, sometimes you can promote diacetyl in your beer. And that's an off flavor that kind of tastes like buttered popcorn or butterscotch, that kind of thing. And I was worried about pitching my hops in there at the end of fermentation if it wasn't fully completed. And the reason is because when you pitch in the hops, there's some residual sugars and starches, and they start working on those hops a little bit. And when that happens, they'll create some diacetyl, but the yeast is almost done finishing up, and there's usually not enough to kind of clean up that diacetyl flavor, which normally happens during your fermentation process. But if you pitch too late in your process and it hasn't quite finished, sometimes it'll leave some of that butterscotch or buttered popcorn flavor diacetyl, and that's gonna ruin your batch. And so I left this go for an additional week on purpose, just to make sure that hopefully got cleaned up. And again, I have not tasted this yet. I just kegged it, carved it up, and we're gonna do that today. So by letting it sit for a week and making sure that it was completely cleaned up, it did drop the final gravity down, actually lower than what I anticipated, which was that 1014. It actually got to 1011, and that actually brought the ABV up to about 7.1%, which is a little higher than the 6.1 we were shooting for, right? So at this point, I was a little high on the original gravity and a little bit low on the final gravity, and so the beer ended up being 1% higher, so probably more like an IPA than a pale ale now, because it's got a little bit higher ABV, but who cares? We're gonna test it. We're gonna find out what I think of this beer realistically. I don't think it necessarily was the yeast's fault that it stalled. It could have been a couple things that I did. Sometimes it's just the way brewing goes. Maybe this happens, but I'm kind of sweating it right now, but it might not be that big of a deal. It might be a great beer. So let's tap it real quick and we'll find out how it turned out. All right, so here it is, and my first impression is it has some chill haze, which is kind of expected for the first couple of days. I could add some gelatin if I wanted to. It also is a little undercarbonated, and so I should have a little bit thicker head on this thing. It probably just needs to sit a few more days at a little bit higher PSI in order to get this thing carved up correctly, but it is a little bit undercarved. I could tell that even as I was pouring it. All right, let's go through aroma and flavor. So first, aroma. The good news is I don't smell any diacetyl at all. So some maltiness, but not a lot of hops, but it also isn't carved up a lot either. So maybe as I get those bubbles kind of forming at the top and giving some head, maybe some more aromatics will come out of that. But as of right now, I can't really smell a whole lot of hop aroma with that extra ounce of dry hopping that I did during fermentation. So without further ado, let's give her a taste. The good news is I also don't taste any diacetyl, so that's good. In this case, no, I just get a very malty beer. I don't even get a whole lot of the Cascade flavors. I get a standard pale ale. I wish it had a little bit more hop character and a little more hop aroma. Maybe that will happen as it kind of conditions a couple more days, but it's actually a nice, solid, summery beer. For being 7% too, because it's a little bit higher than it really should be, it doesn't taste overly alcohol. I think the higher mash temperature though, and the little bit of crystal malt that we put in there, that Simpsons Crystal Light is a 38 Lovibond malt, and so it does have a little bit more malty character to it, and I get that malty and that sweetness out of this as well. So again, you know, not a bad beer. It's actually a pretty good summer beer. You know, check out this recipe. It's a pretty good recipe. I had my kind of hiccups with it. I don't know that this one turned out, you know, perfectly how it could have if I didn't have those hiccups, but still I was very worried about, you know, having that diacetyl flavor, and I'm not getting that. So I'm very happy about it. If I wanted to clean this thing up for a competition or something, I would let this you know, carb up a little bit more and add some gelatin. Since I'm just drinking it at my house, I don't care that it's crystal clear, and after a few days of being in that keg, it's gonna end up clearing out anyway, so not a huge deal. This one, the friends and neighbors we're gonna down, they're not gonna know the difference. They're gonna pour it and think it's a great pale ale, and they're gonna drink it all day. I'll have this recipe that I did, exactly how I did it, in the video description below. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button, helps the channel out a lot. Happy brewing, and cheers. Thanks for watching my video. I really do appreciate it. Another couple ways that you can help support the channel is by hitting that like and subscribe button. You can also check out the merchandise in our store. I have other shirts. We got glassware, we got stickers, hats, sweatshirts, etc. Go check it out. Also, hit that video here. You know you want to.